Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Respectability webinar, Gaining Marketable Skills Through Podcasting. My name is Eric Asher, and I am the Senior Communications Associate here at Respectability. I will be moderating today's webinar. To provide a brief visual description, I am a white man with short brown blackish hair, a barely visible stubble, wearing glasses, an Apple Watch, and a gray polo shirt, and my pronouns are he, him, his. So, what is a podcast? The easiest way to describe a podcast for someone who has never heard of one is that it's like an on-demand talk radio show. Podcasts have been around for more than 20 years, starting back in the iPod era, which is where the name podcasting came from, a mashup of iPod and broadcasting. Today, however, podcasts are easier to listen to than ever, and there are more options about what you can listen to than ever. In January 2023, there were more than 2.5 million podcasts in Apple's directory. These podcasts include panel conversations, interviews, narratives, news, and plenty of other formats, too many for me to name here. Podcasting can be helpful for people to gain various skills that stand out to employers. So in today's webinar, we're going to introduce you to two Respectability National Leadership Fellows, Noah Porton and Hannah Russell, who have both worked on a podcast. Their podcasting skills helped them receive their fellowship offers, as our team was able to see their skills in action. I also will be joined by my colleague Ben Bond, who had a paid gig conducting interviews for a podcast while in college. We'll be talking about how they have created and worked on podcasts in various ways, including interview and narrative. This conversation will last approximately 1 hour, and we'll have plenty of time for participant Q&A at the end. If you'd like to view the ASL interpreter in a larger screen, we invite you to pin her video, which will spotlight her throughout the entire panel. We will be taking questions from you during the second half of the panel. And to preemptively answer the most commonly asked question that I get on the back end of these, yes, this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on Respectability's website tomorrow or probably Friday after I add open captions to the video. Please add your questions to the Q&A box if you have any. And now I'd like to welcome my colleagues on to introduce themselves, give a brief visual description of their pronouns, and each of them could describe a little bit about why they started working on podcasts. We'll start with you, Ben.
Hey, everybody. I'm so grateful to be here, and I'm so glad you can join us for this awesome conversation. I'm really excited to hear from my colleagues, Hannah and Noah, about their work as well. My name is Ben Bond. I use he and they pronouns. I am a white person with a brown beard, brown glasses, brown hair, and a blue polka dot shirt. I am the Faith, Inclusion, and Belonging Associate here at Respectability, and I am also ordained in the Disciples of Christ, which is a progressive mainline Protestant tradition. And what brought me into podcasting, I was a graduate student at Yale University, and I was a part of the Institute of Sacred Music. And there was a really incredible opportunity for students to interview visiting scholars to the Institute. My background was, what brought me to the Institute was work in ethnomusicology, and I got to interview some incredible scholars whose work spanned the globe and all sorts of different disciplines. So I'm excited to talk to you all about that today. And I think I will pass it to Dr. Rousseau.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm Dr. Hannah Roussel. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white woman in my mid-30s with reddish brown hair, today in a braid, green glasses, and a blue and white striped blouse. My background is mostly gray with the Respectability 10-year anniversary logo in the top right corner. I'm a Faith, Inclusion, and Belonging Fellow. My doctorate is in history with a focus in disability and madness in ancient Judaism. The podcast that I worked on was through the University of Michigan. It was the history podcast Reverb Effect. For a year, I was on the editorial board, and then for a year, I was the season producer. I got into podcasting because as I was doing my doctoral studies, I became more and more aware of how inaccessible higher education can be and the knowledge produced in academia. And so I began searching for ways to like break down the walls of the ivory tower, so to speak, and to make the knowledge being produced in academia not only more accessible, but a two-way street of conversation between the public and academics. I also just love podcasts. I listen to them a lot on my free time, both educational and entertainment. So that's what drew me into podcasting. And now I'll send it to Noah.
Thanks, Hannah. I'm Noah. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a white woman with long, dark brown, wavy hair. I'm wearing a black turtleneck sweater with a jean jacket on top. And I also have the same gray background with the Respectability 10th anniversary logo in the top right-hand corner. And so I founded and hosted a podcast about dating relationships with chronic illness and disability. And I started it because I wanted to answer questions that I had and that I knew other folks in my community had, many were thinking of, but perhaps there was too much kind of stigma or taboo around it to ask. And so ultimately, I really wanted to shed light on stories I felt were underrepresented. So yeah, I got to kind of talk to members of the chronic illness and disability community about how they were navigating dating relationships and like stories of intimacy and love and kind of stories that we don't often see authentically represented in the media. And that's kind of what drove my passion to and desire to work in entertainment. I also forgot to mention that I'm an entertainment and news media fellow here at RespectAbility. So yeah.
I can chime in and say they both have incredible podcasts and you all should check them out. Go ahead, Eric.
Thank you very much. So my first question, which is for everyone, is so Ben, you mentioned that they all have remarkable podcasts. So what is your podcast about, each of you? And what drew you to the topic that you chose in particular? And why don't we start with Noah this time? We'll go in reverse order.
Yeah, I guess I accidentally kind of answered that question a bit in the intro, but
I noticed that it's fine.
but yeah, I guess one day I Googled how to date with chronic illness and the internet didn't have a good answer. So I was like, well, let me ask some folks in the community and just broadcast it publicly on the internet. But like through these conversations, I realized that it wasn't like chronically ill people that needed to learn how to date, but it was the entertainment industry that needed to learn how to represent us in relationships authentically, because that was stories that I hadn't seen often. And I think that's what drew me to want to kind of amplify and highlight those stories. Yeah, I think that answers the question. I'll pass it off to Hannah.
Yeah, so the podcast I worked on was already a pre-established podcast, right? Like I said, it's a public history podcast by the University of Michigan's history department. And each episode is a different topic. A historian at the University of Michigan, be they graduate, student, postdoctoral, or faculty member, will submit an episode proposal and say, there's a little bit of this of my research that I think would make a good podcast episode. If we accept the proposal, we help them turn that into an episode. And it's all about how the history of the past reverberates into the present. And so that's the title, Reverb Effect. I guess I became interested in this topic. I also shared a little bit about that because it's just a way, I think a lot of times academics feel pressured to write in big words and complex sentences, but you don't have to, even when you're talking about complex ideas. And podcasting is a great avenue for scholars to learn how to present their work in a way that anyone, even non-experts in the field, can understand. And I just really enjoyed the creative process and collaborating with all of these different historians, and helping them get their research out to a broader audience.
I can piggyback off of that. My podcast was also in academia, and it was interview based. Hannah's is narrative based, and so a lot of these scholars are really working hard to live into their expertise and use those big words. So I do feel like there was a bit of a there was some barriers there of entry for folks listening. And I think that would be something I would have done differently had I been directing the podcast. Anyway, we don't have to go too into changes yet, but it was a really cool opportunity where I got to interview scholars about their work at the intersection of religion and the arts. So it ranged from folks talking about music in Kenyan Christianity, sacred drumming practices in Haitian voodoo, and their relation to ecology, and indigenous worship practices in California Catholic spaces. And it was really meaningful to kind of apply some of the expertise I had gained in my studies, to have the opportunity to talk to these folks that think so deeply about these subjects that are pretty niche for the average person, and to be able to, like Hannah said, bring it to the larger public. But yeah, so that's a little bit what it was about. And I'm happy for Eric to ask Hannah and Noah some questions.
I was happy to do so as well, and then I realized that Noah and Hannah did the same thing again, which is awesome. Which is that I sort of started to answer his question in our previous question answers, but we will ask it anyway. So what skills did you both gain from working on the podcast that you worked on? Like, I sort of picked up that Hannah learned a bit about like distilling information and public speaking a bit, but what are some other skills that you both gained? And I'll let you decide who wants to go first.
I can start us off. If maybe we can just keep going in reverse order. We'll
Yeah,
trade
we'll switch it every time. We'll make it
Yeah.
confusing.
So I gained a lot of skills working on the podcast. Some of it was writing for diverse and non-expert audiences, since mine was a scripted podcast. Also, since I was editing other people's writing, that was experience in editing, providing constructive feedback, and then, a lot of things that you might not think of off the top, but because my podcast was, I think, kind of unique in that it had an editorial board. There was a lot of business emails I had to write. So you get like the business writing skills in that sense, and managing a team, because I had to say, okay, can these two members of the editorial board review this episode? And can you have your review for it back by this date, So there's also collaboration, which I mentioned, project management and data management. I had to track each episode's progress because I was working on more than one episode at a time. So there's also the skill of multitasking, which you see a lot on job applications. And also creative problem solving. There were times where there were conflicts where the episode producer, the historian whose episode it was, wanted to do something one way and the editorial board disagreed. And I was the go-between in between the two. So I had to come up with creative problem solving and sometimes even exercise a bit of conflict resolution skills. So things you might not associate with podcasting, but definitely are skills you can gain from it.
Am I next?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, similar to some similar skills that I gained to Hannah, but I think for me, I didn't set out originally when I made my podcast to like gain marketable skills. It wasn't a career thing for me at the time. I was actually like had been studying something completely different in school, but I was on medical leave, and so it was a passion project. But like anyone who knows me knows I'm like not chill about anything. Like whenever I, mention to someone like, oh yeah, I'll do this just for fun. They're like, okay, like can't relate to people who have hobbies or things like that. So it quickly became like, okay, well, I'm really, really going to do this. And yeah, because of that, like I gained so many skills, and it also kind of took me down a whole career path because I decided to kind of switch careers and go into entertainment. But yeah, so I gained, skills in like production, like learned how to edit audio, and worked on some video clips as well. Also, I think Hannah mentioned collaboration. That was a big thing for me because I did not do it by myself. I collaborated with also an audio editor on several episodes, and also a graphic designer for branding. And so I learned so much from them. And it was really cool to get to like work creatively on a project. Also like a lot of marketing, because I did like a social media for the podcast. And so I had like a content calendar, and, like did things on Canva. Also worked on like community partnerships. So I did a launch event series with actually a RespectAbility alumni fellow, Sneha, who has an organization now called Generation Patient. Was called Health Advocacy Summit. So we did like a launch event series for my podcast. So a lot of like transferable skills for marketing stuff. And then also like content development, which I found is really helpful in entertainment for, podcast development roles, but also like transferable to TV development or things like that, because, understanding a target audience, researching topics, researching guests, reaching out to guests and stuff. And those are also like really helpful skills for business. I think like just the basics of understanding who your audience is and kind of creating content for them. So yeah, pass it back to, to Eric, I think.
Yep. Both fantastic answers. Lots and lots of skills to be gained from this type of thing you can do. So Ben, you interviewed individuals for the Institute of State Good Music at Yale about the intersection of religion and art. Can you share some tips about how to create a list of questions and conduct an interview? And did you gain, I mean, you've spoken so eloquently so far, so obviously the answer is yes, but did you gain public speaking skills as part of doing this podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm happy to share like where I feel like I messed up. I feel like sometimes it's helpful as folks that are in, professional spaces or creative spaces to have examples of like not everybody is just like doing this perfectly and knows exactly what's going on. I found out, in my first couple episodes that these really long, convoluted questions that really like it felt, trying to demonstrate my own intellectual prowess, and like that I had done all this research. And I found out that if I wanted to be a good interviewer, I really needed to like lean into humility, and realize that like in order to like actually feature the work of the person that I am talking to, it can't, the focus can't be on me. It needs to be about, highlighting and bringing to life the work of the person that I'm talking to. So I learned how to really scale back in the way I was asking questions. I found that generally speaking, sometimes the shorter the question, the more succinct, the more to the point the question can be. Brevity is really important. The better answers I would get. I found that like when I asked a whole host of things all at once, and again, this applies in so many different arenas, right? The person I was interviewing would get really confused, and wouldn't know what to latch onto, and it became readily apparent to me quite quickly that this was not a strategy that was going to work. And if you're going to be, doing an interview style podcast, as opposed to a narrative form, it's really important to think through how to craft your questions, in a very considerate way. And I'd say a good rule of thumb, these are just kind of tricks of the trade, and this goes for, hosting a webinar, is to have, for an hour, you need like 5 questions, generally speaking, depending on the type of person that is going to be interviewed. But generally, folks know how to speak a lot. The challenge is helping folks learn how to speak concisely and effectively. And so helping kind of shepherd them in that experience is something that I find to be really helpful in your podcasting life, but also in just every day, if you're organizing meetings, having those agenda items and knowing how to help folks convey the information without having to go into a huge monologue about it. And I'll say academics are really good at filling time when they're speaking. So knowing the type of person you're interviewing and their style is really important. So yeah, that's my advice for how to conduct an interview, and the ways that I have failed. And so you can learn from them so you do not have to fail yourself.
And I will say we're learning from him as we go, because some of these questions are a little bit long as well. But but anyway, so building off of that, and I'm going to open it up to Noah and Hannah as well for this next one. But can you talk a little bit about how important prep work is before you start recording a podcast episode? And again, this is open to all of you, but Ben, we'll start with you.
Yeah, it's really essential. It's really, I think as you get more comfortable with the podcasting process, you'll develop a bit more of a checklist of things you want to go through before having an interview with someone. I'm sure Noah can speak on this really well, because Noah's had a whole host of guests. And I found that it was really important for me to get to understand the scholar's work. So, if they've written some articles, I would definitely check that out. One thing I've also found to be really helpful is if they've been on other podcasts, listen to those podcasts. Because often, folks who are going to be interviewed regularly kind of have a few talking points that they've really honed. And when they're encountering new audiences, they will go through those talking points and they'll sound like the most brilliant person ever, because they've said it a million times. And so if you're able to prompt that and kind of offer these softballs to folks by doing that research ahead of time, it can make a world of difference. So I'd love to hear Noah's perspective, because Noah's met with a whole host of really incredible guests from all over the professional and personal space.
Well, same to you, Ben, and I really appreciate your perspective on like starting with reflecting on, things that you could have improved on. I really like that, and a ton was already coming to mind for me as well. But to answer that specific question, yeah, I agree. A prep is really essential. I think sometimes when people think of podcasting, they're like, oh yeah, you just kind of like put your phone on the table, like your like voice notes, and you just chat and you just post it, which definitely you can use that in terms of tech, but I think it's helpful to do some prep beforehand. And like you said, Ben, like really I would always kind of research the guest. I would look at their work that they've done, their like social media. And yeah, I would try to kind of look at other podcasts and stuff. For me, I kind of wanted to get a different perspective than maybe what they had talked about on other podcasts or things like that. So I would kind of keep that in mind. And I did this at the beginning, but then towards the end, especially if it was like a busier guest didn't always have time for this. But sometimes I would have like a pre-meeting, just like 10-15 minutes to get to know them. And I felt like that really helped with rapport and just to like brief them on everything. And then I would send them the questions beforehand to make sure that they were comfortable with everything. But for me, like in everybody's podcast is really different style. I really wanted my podcast to be very conversational. So that was something that was hard to balance of like, kind of staying on topic and stuff, but also like having conversations, especially when you hadn't had that pre-meeting and you didn't know the person. So I would send the list of questions and kind of some prep details, but say, you know, this is just kind of a general guide, but it's very conversational. So feel free to ask me questions as well, and we can just chat. And yeah, if I couldn't have a pre-meeting, I tried to just talk to them for a few minutes before the interview. But yeah, definitely like knowing your guests, knowing what their work is, what's important to them, what they like talking about.
Anything to add, Hannah? Or
Yeah. So, I mean, for the prep work was very different for me because it was a scripted podcast or narrative style. And for me also, though, you know, academics can also be very verbose in their writing. So I had a lot of meetings with the episode producer, the historian that was doing the episode. And one of the main things I learned to ask them is, what is the main point you want to communicate in this episode? And ask them to pick one. Normally they're going to add on a second one, and then that's okay. And so, you know, for example, one of the episodes I produced was titled Laboring for the Puerto Rican Vote. And it was about Puerto Rican migrant workers in Connecticut in the 1950s fighting for the right to vote. Elena Rosario, the historian who's researched this, was about, you know, her main point was Puerto Ricans were wanting to be active citizens from the very beginning. And I was like, okay, so that's how we're going to craft this story around that message. And that really helped us find a focus. And it also helped us find a narrative arc. When you're preparing a scripted episode, even if it's an academic podcast or an educational one, it really helps to find a story that you can demonstrate your point through, because that's going to engage listenership more. There's also the technicalities of setting up your recording space, getting the right equipment. I was very fortunate that the University of Michigan had a recording booth with equipment that we could use, but I've also learned, you know, helpful tips and tricks for like kind of DIYing your own recording space. If people want to hear about that, they can ask about it in the questions session. Also, like building in time to find your narrator voice. I would do, the season producer is the host for the season. So I would do the intro and outro to the episode, but the historian would read their script. And so we needed time during the recording session for them to like get a feel for how they wanted their voice to sound as they were reading the script. And, you know, we needed time to do a few takes.
Yep. Some great advice all around. Yep. Basically, the more you prepare ahead of time, the better it's going to be. So Noah and Hannah, as I said in the intro, you're both fellows with Respectability. And during the application process, my colleagues were impressed with the skills you each acquired from your experience with podcasting. So how do you talk about, first of all, questions, do you talk about podcasting in job interviews and applications? And if so, how? And I think Hannah went first last time, so Noah, you're up.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I do talk about it, and my podcast for me was a big reason why I decided to go back to school and study business and film and media studies, and like why I wanted to work in the entertainment space. So I definitely use it to talk about like my why, and I use that in my Respectability interviews as well, like why, how it empowered me to want to develop and amplify authentic and impactful stories. And then I also use it like any other work experience to pull from for like behavioral questions. So like problem solving, like tell me about a time when you problem solve, for example. Like I could talk about like when I was trying to clean up my files in Audacity, and then everything just got destroyed because Audacity doesn't like it when you move files in anyways. And so how I problem solved that, or like, how I adapted, talking about like an episode that I recorded with a chronic illness travel influencer. And when I reached out to her originally, it was like very, very beginning of the pandemic, back when we thought pandemic would be like 2 weeks. So I was like, oh yeah, let's talk about like traveling with a partner while chronically ill. And then we released the episode, and it was there was still a pandemic. There still is one, but at the time there was a travel ban. So I had to adapt and think about like how can I kind of market this episode. And so I ended up kind of creating content for social media about quote unquote traveling in a COVID cautious way. So like, going camping to like a kind of secluded campsite, although I'm realizing that might be very creepy, but having someone with you, or kind of like watching a travel show or things like that. So yeah, using it to talk about behavioral questions or skills, like you would with any other job interview. Yeah, I think like when I first, at first when I was kind of entering the job market and stuff, I didn't necessarily consider my podcast to be like as worthy as like an internship or a job, or quote unquote like a people who would have that like traditional path in terms of like talking about it in interviews. But I realized that it is just as important and impressive, and I gained just as many skills. So yeah, I'd encourage anyone like who has done their own thing, whether that's because they were trying to get skills specifically, or because that was like a work experience that was most accessible to them and their health at the time, to be really proud of that and use that experience and talk about it, because you did gain skills from that. I'm sure you did. So
You're up, Hannah.
Yeah, so I, piggybacking off of what Noah said, and what I already said, I said it earlier, but I think almost every job I've applied to has either mentioned data management or project management in the job description. And no matter what type of podcast you're producing, you're doing both of those things. And so you can like go into detail in an interview and say like, I created a Excel spreadsheet to track the progress of each episode. I created these folders in Google Drive where I could share documents with the people I'm collaborating with. And use that to demonstrate those like basic skills that a lot of jobs want you to have. Also, one thing that I forgot to mention earlier is when I was working for Reverb Effect, I noticed that we needed to improve, we needed to start using alt text on our websites for our images. That's text that a screen reader reads in place of the image, so that if someone's using a screen reader, they still know what the images are on the website. And also that our transcripts were rather lacking in accessibility as well. There were things like the intro to the episode plays. And so it was very easy for me to go in and transcribe the intro to the episode. And from then on, that could be copy and pasted into each episode transcript from here on out. I also built materials and guidelines for future season producers to use, because it's a new season producer each year. And so I can also bring those stories into my applications and interviews, where I can show my commitment to DEI or my commitment to accessibility. And even if that's something the job position isn't looking for, I can use that as a story of how I took initiative. Which is something that jobs also like to learn a lot about in some cases. You can say, I was dedicated, I saw this need, I came up with a solution. And that's always very impressive in interviews as well. So yeah, like Noah said, like thinking about what are the stories that you can pull and use in your interviews, and what are those transferable skills that you can pull out and put in your resume.
I love the idea of incorporating accessibility into it. As a disability organization, that's obviously very important to all of us. So a reminder to our attendees, you can put in any questions for any of our panelists into the Q&A box on Zoom. We are unfortunately not able to monitor the chat on Facebook at this time, but you can feel free to join us on Zoom. There's still plenty of time, you can still register. And we will be happy to raise those questions to the panelists. But while we're waiting for any questions from our audience, I'd like to ask each of our panelists. There's so many pieces of advice that we've given throughout this, or at least alluded to. What if you had to pick one thing that you want a new podcaster to know about how to do a great job making a podcast, what would be the number one piece of advice you'd give? And I'll start with Ben on that one.
That is a good question. I think the thing that I love just in general in my life, but what I think the medium of podcasting does really well is it allows you to follow your curiosity. And I think my number one piece of advice is really lean into your curiosity. I myself have, sometimes it's a double-edged sword. I have such insatiable curiosity sometimes that I get so hung up on one thing, I have to figure everything out about it. I'm sure the neurodivergent folks among us know that well, myself included. And so I think give yourself permission to really dive deep, dive wide, and answer questions that you've always had, and let this format be a really great tool for exploring that within yourself. And when you're doing that, when you give yourself that permission, whatever sort of format of podcast you're going to approach or utilize, it's just going to enhance the experience of the folks that you're speaking with, the content that you're creating or crafting. And yeah, I think that you will also grow as a person. And at the end of the day, that's what this is all about. That's my pastoral side speaking. You don't get that time back, and using this opportunity to grow as a person and really learn to love the parts of yourself that are so curious is a really incredible experience. So yeah, that's my emotional end note for you all, and I can pass it to Hannah or Noah.
Let's go Noah this time.
Love that, Ben. So yeah, I think my advice would be like the first thing to start with, and this is what I started with when I started my podcast, is to have a clear purpose / goal of your podcast. Like write it like a mission statement. At least that's kind of what I did and what worked for me. So like, why are you creating this podcast? Because, it is a fairly, especially if you're doing it yourself, it's going to be a fairly large time investment. I mean, also you can put in as much or as little kind of effort or time as you want, but it likely will be a big production. So kind of knowing like what your purpose is, I think can help keep you on track. So like, is it to kind of, like Ben said, really kind of follow your curiosity and investigate a question or topic you feel hasn't been discussed publicly and needs to be brought light to? Maybe it's kind of a personal thing, like to empower yourself or share your story, and that can be cathartic. But, or maybe, you have a brand or you already have a business and you're trying to like increase brand awareness or attract more clients or position yourself as an expert in your industry. Maybe you're trying to share stories from underrepresented voices. So knowing that why, and then kind of knowing who your audience is and what they need that your content can give them that other content can't or hasn't. So yeah, keeping them in mind.
Yeah, I think building off of that, I already talked about finding the narrative if you're going to be doing a scripted podcast. Another thing that is really important is keeping your audience in mind and trying to put yourself in their shoes. So if you think about when do you listen to podcasts, a lot of times it's when you're doing other tasks. You're doing dishes, going for a run, driving in your car, riding the bus. Maybe it's a noisy bus and you're distracted because you've got to pay attention and notice when your bus stop is coming. And so you want to keep your language in your podcast like clear, your syntax simple, your sentence structure simple. Because it's also, when you're reading a book, it's often easier to flip back a few pages and be like, oh, okay, yeah, that's right, that's what they said. And it can be more difficult to do when you're listening. So for example, I was producing a podcast where we were talking about a historical figure who had multiple titles, and throughout the script, the historian was like alternating which title he used for like flair. Well, that might work in a written form because you can go back to the first page where that figure is introduced and be like, oh yeah, these are all this titles he has. But in an audio form, we said you need to pick how you're going to identify this historical figure and stick with it, because audio listeners, it's going to be more confusing. So, just thinking about that, and not being afraid to repeat things, because people are going to get distracted. They're going to reverse. I don't know, my car, when I reverse, it like dampens the audio for a second. And so, and sometimes I'm able to like push the 10-minute or the 10-second rewind, and other times I got to start driving and I can't. So, keeping this in mind when you're creating your podcast content.
I am also going to take the liberty of answering that question from my own perspective as moderator's privilege in this case. I think the number one, all those pieces of advice are great. My number one thing is that unless you care about the subject, you're not going to be able to do a good job making a podcast about it. So when you pick your topic, pick something you really, really are passionate about, something that you love discussing with anybody, everybody. Find that thing, and then you'll be able to make a good podcast about it. So we've got a couple questions from the audience. We got three very, I would say, hard to answer ones from a former fellow, Alex Hilke. So I'm going to ask them in turn, because none of these questions really have defined answers, which is fun for conversation. So I'm going to ask the last one first. What is the best podcast software? Does anyone have any recommendations? I know I have some potential options.
I can, I mean, there's different there's different tech for different like aspects of podcasting, but I can't speak to the best. For editing, I used Audacity. I don't know if it's the best. It's definitely kind of, I think, maybe antiquated in some ways, but it's just what I happen to learn on. But I think a lot of the audio editing softwares are really similar. Like there's GarageBand, there's Pro Tools, there's Adobe Audition. I think it's just like a matter of some are free, some are, on Mac, some are not, or some are on Windows. So I don't know that that matters too much, but I will say one that I really liked for recording remote interviews was Zencastr. They have, I believe now they have a video feature as well. And what I liked about it is that you can, at the time it was free, don't know if it still is, but you could record and get 2 separate audio tracks. And I really liked that because that allowed me to edit the audio and it be more clear. If there was like a weird sound in one person's audio, I could kind of like mute that or cut that. So I really liked that. And then for hosting, I used Anchor, which is now Spotify for podcasters, because it was free and it was easy. So I don't know. I think you can keep it simple, and you could spend a lot of money if you wanted to. And I don't think it's necessarily necessary at first. So.
Yeah, my experience is both in Audacity and Adobe Audition. Adobe Audition you do have to pay for, because I the university provided it, so I could use it. Were I to start podcasting on my own, I don't think I could afford Adobe Audition. But Audacity works too. One thing I would recommend is finding a software that lets you use, I think it's called non-destructive editing. It's where you can like trim your audio and it doesn't delete that data. So if you later decide, oh, I want to pull that back, it'll still be there for you to pull back. It's just like a fail safe. You're not going to accidentally, it's harder to accidentally delete your audio. If you, and Audacity and Audition both have that tool. Audacity didn't used to, but now it does. I can't really speak to the other things because I was only involved in the recording and editing step, and then the executive producer was the one who posted it.
Yeah.
Better because I have a lot of things.
Well, you have, I should also say for context for the audience, Eric is a podcaster himself. And I'll also agree with you on that, Eric. Finding whatever you choose, it has to be something you are really invested in. And I would also say the more niche, the better. You don't worry about being, it has to be super accessible. People love niche when it comes to podcasts. People love deep content, not necessarily wide. I mean, I've listened to podcasts in the best Detroit pizza in Michigan, like that, so it's really yeah, follow your curiosity. I used Zencaster, and I think, yeah, to Noah's point, like it was fairly accessible, not accessible necessarily in the disability sense, but in the like as a new podcaster. I've heard Riverside FM is really helpful for video audio stuff. And I know we have software that RespectAbility has access to that Eric can probably talk to us more about. But yeah, I definitely, so I can also just say very briefly, if you are someone who's less comfortable with learning about software stuff, there are a lot of folks that are experts about it. There are a lot of courses on some like LinkedIn Learning and YouTube. I also, for the first couple episodes, we had a script printed out of the podcast itself after I've conducted the interview, and I went through and edited it through just like a Word document so that I can get kind of the gist of it before going through and doing the tech part. So there's a lot of ways to approach it that can make it simpler for you as someone who's getting into that space. So and I can pass to Eric, who has a lot of knowledge about this.
I'm gonna go as quickly as I can, speaking at times, so we can give time for the other two questions that Alex asked. So the first thing is, if you're on an iPad, if you have an iPad, there's apparently a great app called Ferrite that I've heard a lot of great things about. That lets you actually take the podcast, it'll automatically do an auto-generated transcript, and then it'll let you edit the audio as text, and it's apparently very, very good. Heard nothing but good things about it. As far as I'm recording interviews, I personally am a big fan of Rogue Amoeba. They're a Mac only company, software company, and they have a product called Audio Hijack, which lets you basically do the thing where you can separate an audio into multiple different tracks. And as Noah, I think, alluded to, it's very helpful when you're editing a podcast to have different tracks for every single person that's speaking. Audio Hijack recently added an auto transcribe feature as well, which is a great way to get started on having a transcript for your podcast, which is very important for making it accessible. And then the last thing I'll say is that Audacity is free and it's fantastic, and it's available on all platforms, and I highly recommend anyone who wants to get started with audio editing. Audacity is a great place to start. And then as far as hosting, there's so many different options, but Spotify for podcasters is free, and it works on not just Spotify, but if you host your podcast, you can get it on all the platforms, which is very helpful. So the next question, which I think we'll get through pretty quickly, is how long does it take to edit your podcast? And for this one, I think the answer is, unless anyone disagrees, is that depends on the podcast. Basically, depends how much time you want to put into it, and depends on how much for work needs to be done, how many edits there need to be made. There's no real answer for that, but I'll open it up to anyone else unless they see it. If anyone has anything more definitive.
I can say also not super definitively, it'll probably take more time than the podcast took to actually like do the interview. If that's helpful.
It takes more time than you think. And I was telling my sister who was interested in starting a podcast, and this also builds off of what Eric says. It really depends on what vibe you're going for in your podcast. Reverb Effect is a very like professional podcast. So I have to go through and silence all of the breaths people took. If there was a cough, getting the music transition just right. These sorts of things can really take a lot of time. Now, if you want a more casual feel, you want someone to feel like they're there in the conversation with you, maybe you leave in some of the coughs and some of the before you start speaking, because that's going to create a more chill, welcoming vibe in a sense. So but either way you go, I think it's going to take you longer than you expect. But as you gain the skill, it's also going to go more quickly each time.
No, anything to add on that one, or?
I feel like y'all answered it well.
Okay.
But yeah, happy to take any of the other questions.
Yeah, I think we're gonna go to the next one, which I think, unless we get something else in the next minute, will be our last question, which is about humor in your podcast, which is sort of a fun one. I'll just give my answer to that first, and I'll turn it over to everyone else. My answer is feel free to inject humor in your podcast, but don't say anything unless you're comfortable saying it. Basically, it depends on your comfort level. Basically, I personally, on my podcast, which I'm not going to bring up here because I do a little bit too much humor in it, I would argue, for a professional setting. But yes, I think it's all about it's about your comfort level. But anyone have any thoughts on that?
That's a hard one. Yeah, I wanted my podcast to be kind of like fun and conversational. Like I wanted it to feel like you were chatting with like a best friend about like dating and relationships. So I definitely wanted that vibe, but yeah, it's hard. I think one thing that, and this was like advice I read probably somewhere on the internet, it was like, ask your guests to think of some specific stories. And so like, you can ask them like, is there a funny story like for dating specifically? Like there were so many, and so like, so you could ask them to kind of think about those beforehand and then kind of like talk about specific stories. Cause like Hannah mentioned, like the storytelling aspect is really important in podcasts. And then, like bring up your own funny stories, like again, depending on the vibe of your podcast. But if it is like a conversational, kind of like a podcaster I really admire that does this is Armchair Expert, Dax and Monica. Like they often kind of tell their own kind of vulnerable, funny, silly stories. And then that makes the guests feel comfortable and they kind of share their own. So yeah, but I don't know if I have any other better advice other than that.
Yeah, and I'd probably say to Hannah and ours, if it's thematically appropriate, I'm sure it's really hard to interject humor in a narrative podcast, but also it's kind of difficult when you're talking about like heavy academic stuff. But I think if you were trying to cultivate some humor for a podcast and its interview style or conversational style, I think going back to what Noah said before, having an opportunity to speak to folks prior to the actual podcast and kind of establish sort of a comfort and a rapport with the person you're speaking with can be really helpful for carrying that over into the podcast itself. Sometimes the best conversations happen outside of the podcast, unfortunately, which is meaningful for you as a person. But all that being said, even if it's a great conversation, establishing that kind of culture of being able to have a more comfortable and relaxed conversation can lead to a lot more opportunities to have, humor interjected, because you've established that trust that allows for, allows for that opportunity. So yeah, that's my thought.
Yeah, I think my advice would be to find podcasts similar to the one you want to do and listen to them and see how do they inject humor. Reverb Effect, we didn't do a lot of humor, it wasn't the vibe. But I really love the podcast Material Girls. It's two women, they call themselves two lady scholars, but so they're already like having fun with it, right? They're two literature scholars who talk about material culture, and they're bringing in a lot of academic analysis. But they have a lot of fun with it, and it's hilarious. Whenever they quote like a crusty old scholar, like they have like sound effects, like they're like, oh, another old white man, and then they have a sound effect that's a man going blah 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 blah, right? It's hilarious, but then they're still like talking about really intellectual and like important concepts. Like they did one on toxic masculinity and the book Spare that Prince Harry just wrote, and different things like that. So yeah, I would like Material Girls is one podcast that I think integrates humor with a serious topic very well. But I'm sure there are many others out there.
Plenty of it that I can name, but the one thing, the 5 words that come to my mind every time I hear about this are save it for the show. When people are having conversations like this before the podcast, and you want to make sure you save it for the show. On that note, I think we've answered all the other questions that we have. But I wanted to say before we close that we have one more webinar for 2023. It's next Wednesday. It's about why sacred communities need to raise awareness to create a culture of belonging. As I said, next Wednesday, December 13th. You can register for it on our website at respectability.org. And before we close that, I want to say a massive thank you to Noah, Hannah, and Ben, to our cart captioner, our interpreters, and to you for joining us. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and we will hopefully see you next week. Bye, everybody.